Hello, I'm Olivia Mattis, and on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, welcome to another one of our Sunday programs. Today, we have this brand new wonderful book whose author is with us, To Die Beautiful, about a hero named Hannie Schaft, the book written by Buzzy Jackson, whom you'll meet in a little while. Moderating our program will be Felix Pfeifle, whom I'll introduce also in a minute. But first, I wanted to start out on kind of a somber note, which is this horrendous news that we all received about Alexei Navalny, who appears to have been murdered by the Russian government in the last few days. Now, we did a big program about Navalny not that long ago, featuring some of his closest friends. So it's certainly a tragic day for all of us, really the whole world. And I wanted in particular to mention that there are parallels between Navalny, a modern day hero who was murdered for his principles, who lived by his principles and died by his principles, and today's featured hero, Hannie Schaft, who likewise lived by her principles and was killed for it. So what can we do as an audience, as a society? Well, we can remember these people, we can carry on their fight, we can carry on their principles. So I wanted to be sure to mention that right at the outset. Today's moderator is Mr. Felix Pfeifle. Hard to pronounce, Felix, you have to admit.
It is.
He is an architectural designer, and we've been friends for a very long time. He is based in Washington, D.C. He was a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Vienna. He is one of the foremost experts on the Habsburgs. And thanks to him, we had this glorious program about Otto von Habsburg that he also moderated. And we had Otto's son, Karl von Habsburg, on that program that I mentioned to do with Alexei Navalny. So it's really a delight to work with Felix once again. And Felix, please take the floor.
Thank you, Olivia. It's wonderful to be with the Sousa Mendes Foundation again. Buzzy Jackson is the award-winning author of 3 nonfiction books and the novel To Die Beautiful, also called The Girl with Red Hair worldwide, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Buzzy has a PhD in history from UC Berkeley, go Bears, and is a member of the National Book Critics Circle. She is currently at work on a new novel inspired by a mid-century American true crime. Buzzy is also a longtime friend of mine since 1996, when we were young bohemians in New York, finding our way in the world through stories, history, and art, which we are still doing. Welcome, Buzzy.
Thank you, Felix. We're still young bohemians, right? Is that what you meant to say?
We're still charging.
That's right.
Please sweep us into this remarkable story you've formed from the brief life of Hannie Schaft, a college student who became a Nazi assassin and hid her 2 Jewish best friends in her own home while Hannie became a resistance hero out in the streets. Buzzy?
Yeah, I thought I'd just start with a very brief reading from early in the book. This kind of sets the scene a little bit. The book is based on the true story, takes place mostly in Amsterdam and Haarlem in the Netherlands. This reading comes from a point in the book around 1942, which is just after the occupying Nazi regime, which had been occupying Netherlands since 1940. In 1942, they changed all the clocks in the Netherlands to match Berlin time. And Hannie has just seen this happen in the Dam, the central plaza of Amsterdam. And it's a very sort of scary and terrifying feeling for her. This is sort of her reflection later that night. How does evil spread? Like a disease from one human to another? or the way the new anti-Jewish measures sifted down into the private lives of Dutchmen like dust in a closed room, moat by invisible moat, until one day we turned the key in the lock and found ourselves trapped, then looked back at our little room and discovered it so entombed in filth it was not fit in to live anymore. The imposition of Berlin time awakened me to a new truth. We were not awaiting the tragedy, we were now living it. Each time I looked at the alarm by my bedside, I felt that bitter pill grow. Now, when I walked through the city, yellow stars screamed at me from street corners. Do something.
And so this quiet girl growing up in Harlem does something. Tell us about the background she comes from and how she gravitates toward resistance during the Second World War.
Sure, happy to. Hannie Schaft was born in 1920 in Haarlem, which is a city just outside Amsterdam. And she grew up in a middle-class family. Her father was a teacher. Her mother was a homemaker. She had an older sister, Annie, as you can see there in the slide. Annie was really kind of the bright, shining star of the family until she sadly died of diphtheria when Hannie was just 7 years old. And at that point, Hannie's parents seemed to become very protective of their last remaining child for obvious reasons. And so growing up, she was really known as kind of a sheltered, shy, very quiet girl, not the kind of person you would immediately pick out of a crowd as destined to be an armed resistance fighter by any means.
Right. And so in college, we have the impression of someone unsure of who she is, but she takes a liking to two very dynamic figures who come into her life.
Yeah. And here we can see these two lovely women, Feline Polak and Sonia Frank, who were both natives of Amsterdam. And they were also both Jewish, and they were probably the first Jewish friends Hannie had, at least certainly the first close friends. And they all three started law school together in 1940 at the University of Amsterdam there. Um, and things were going well until Jews were barred from public education in 1942. And Hannie became sort of their de facto teacher, teaching them after school the lessons they were no longer allowed to sit in with. And I think that Hannie, because she was out in the streets more than the Jewish girls were at this point because of curfews and other anti-Semitic policies, I think Hannie really started to realize how much danger Jews were in and maybe realized it a little sooner than Sonia and Feline. But in any case, in 1943, Hannie and all Dutch students were required to take an oath of loyalty to the Nazi Party. And at that point, she and about 85% of the Dutch student population refused to take that loyalty oath and were thus kicked out of school. And so at this point in 1943, I think this is really when Hannie has sort of lost everything. And of course, so have her two best friends. And she urges them to come back to Haarlem with her and hide in her parents' home. It's in Haarlem. And
Right.
here we
So, well, yeah, this is a fascinating aspect of the story because because it's a very slow creep into the society of the Netherlands, the Nazi stranglehold on society. And what we see also slowly is Hannie's progressive trajectory in terms of resistance. First, she's teaching her friends at home because they can't learn at school. Then she resigns her membership in school. She brings them, shows up at her parents' house with these Jewish refugees in Harlem. And then she takes further steps once in Harlem.
Yeah.
Tell us about her move directly into the resistance.
Sure. Yeah. She first goes back to Harlem to the house you just saw and sort of convinces her parents and convinces the girls to to hide in this place. Um, and has sort of gone from a progression of her earliest forays into, let's say, volunteering to help refugees. That moves into making transports of like underground newspapers, things like this. And eventually she's recruited to be in the armed resistance, which is, a minority of Dutch resistors were armed, and certainly much, much smaller minority of that group were women. But she took to it readily. And she immediately met these two sisters who we see here, Truus and Freddie Oversteegen. Um, these photos are probably taken more or less around the time that they were in the resistance. Both of these girls joined in their teens. Freddie was only 14 years old when she joined, but they came from a pretty radical activist family that had already been helping a lot of Jewish refugees at this point. And so their mother actually gave them permission to go learn how to shoot a gun and take up these dangerous tasks. In the middle here, you can see two people standing together. That's Truus and Hannie. Truus is dressed up sort of as a man or a boy with her hair tucked into a cap, and Hannie has a scarf around her neck, or around her head, partly probably to disguise her red hair, which was noticeable. But you see, she's also wearing glasses, and those were a disguise. She didn't really wear glasses, but she began to adopt a disguise the further she got into this very dangerous resistance work. In the inset, you can see there her 9mm pistol and the glasses that she wore.
And one of the more thrilling parts of the book is how she learns and from whom she learns to shoot that gun.
Yeah.
Going from just a sort of insecure, anonymous young woman to the potential of being an assassin of Nazis. Tell us about how she how she takes that turn.
Yeah. She, as I mentioned, she got recruited into a resistance cell in Harlem called the Raad van Verzet, which means the Council of Resistance. And they were a pretty notorious group. They were an armed resistance group. And on her very first day, a member of that group, a man named Jan Bonnekamp, showed up to train her and start to give her a gun and show her how to shoot it. Here we can see Jan, very handsome, dashing young man. He was already quite a big hero in the resistance by the time Hannie met him. And they made a really interesting pair because Hannie was really an intellectual. She was the best educated member of their resistance group by far. And Jan was a shop floor steelworker who had been a leader of the resistance and kind of worked his way up from the grassroots. But they did fall in love and became also a duo in their assassinations, a very effective duo. And I do think that this is, this was definitely her first love affair. And it's almost too perfect. As a historian, when I saw the photo of Jan, I thought, oh, come on, he looks like a movie star, But yeah, he was a great hero in his own right.
Well, the teacher student relationship and the love affair that blossoms from there between the two is and his matinee good looks are made for at least your book for now.
That's right.
And I'm glad that you've been able to tell that story. And just to imagine the sort of assassinations they accomplished on bicycles.
Yeah.
I think the one of Fake Christ is
Yes.
most striking, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the bicycles because we can't forget that everything that Hannie and Jan and all of these resistors did during the resistance was by bicycle. Here we have a photo, and this is one of the most famous photos from the Dutch Holocaust experience This is a photo of a Nazi collaborator, a Dutch man named Fake Christ, who was notorious among members of the resistance for turning in dozens and dozens of Jews for payment. And so in that way was personally responsible for the deaths of many, many people. Hannie and Yan did what you might call a ride-by shooting on their bicycles. And she would shoot first and Yan would come up behind and do the final death blow. And keep in mind that this is at a point in the war where, of course, rubber for tires is scarce. It's being used for the Nazi war machine. So most of the bicycles they were riding on are have wooden tires that are constantly breaking and being repaired. And that was also part of the resistance work, was learning how to repair bicycles, especially those, I can only imagine, horrible wooden tires. It's really hard to believe, but you see references to it a lot in the archives.
Um, one of the really striking things about their work together, also with Truce and Freddie, is the moral, the thorough and pure moral qualities of her decision making. That I think really nicely represent the principles of the Susan Mendez Foundation. Could you tell us, for instance, about the decision to refrain on some occasions from assassinations ordered by the resistance?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I do think it's a really important point that, um, for one thing, they all considered, all the resistors considered themselves soldiers, you know, in sort of a guerrilla army. But because they were all volunteer soldiers, they were never ordered to undertake a mission, especially a dangerous one. They had to willingly volunteer to do it. And you know, Hannie and the Oversteegen sisters certainly never shied away from incredibly dangerous missions that went beyond assassinations to sabotage, planting bombs, transporting weapons, all sorts of things. But one place that they did draw the line, and this was in the winter of 1944 and 1945, which was known in the Netherlands as the Hunger Winter. So it was the worst, absolute worst moment of the war for the Dutch. But even in these conditions, Hannie and Truus were offered the opportunity, so to speak, to kidnap the children of the Rijkskommissar of the Netherlands, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was the fanatical Nazi in charge of things at the time. And Truus and Hannie didn't really have to think about it too long and just flatly refused to do it. They felt that there was a difference between what they were doing and what the Nazis were doing. They felt they were fighting to defend their country and their countrymen. And they also felt that there was no way they would involve children in this kind of violence. And so they simply refused. And that action was never taken out by anyone.
Yeah, that's something I appreciated very much about her story and the example she set throughout her resistance work. Um,
Yeah.
what is also interesting is that while she's out on these bicycle adventures, becoming a heroine of the resistance, becoming known to Adolf Hitler himself as the girl with red hair, she's got two girlfriends at home as Jewish refugees with her parents. And what happens with them?
Well, yeah, I mean, this was part of what was so hard about the situation for everybody is, you know, Hannie spent every minute of the day worrying about her two Jewish friends at home. But of course, she was also worried about her parents because it was a punishable offense by death to be harboring Jewish refugees. So her parents were also in extreme danger. And, you know, meanwhile, Hannie's out doing crazy, extremely dangerous stuff. As you mentioned, word got out amongst the Germans about this notorious red-haired female assassin. And indeed, Adolf Hitler, nobody knew her name, so they started calling her the girl with the red hair. And at that point, she started dyeing her hair black. for obvious reasons, and, wearing the glasses and doing whatever she could to hide her identity because she wasn't prepared to stop fighting, at that point.
Mhm.
So I really think she did everything she could to try to keep a low profile, despite all the dangerous things she was involved in.
And um, the love affair between her and the collaboration between her and Jan Bonnekamp comes to a tragic and really heartrending end when Jan himself is struck on a bicycle during an assassination attempt. And there's a very tense moment in the hospital that I think is very gripping for your entire book. Can you tell us about what happens with Jan?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this was just one of the many real life things that happened that as an author, you just think, you could never make this up. But Hannie and Yan were once again on one of their assignments, as I mentioned, writing in sort of single file to commit to take out another collaborator. And they did their usual thing. Hannie drove by, shot her pistol, hit this man. He was actually a Dutch police officer who was a collaborator. And she heard a second gunshot, which is normal. That would be Jan doing his kill shot. She rode off to the safe meeting place, and Jan never showed up. And it turned out that the police officer had shot Jan, and Jan had been wounded, ran off, tried to find help in town, but was turned in by local people and taken to the hospital. And essentially, as he lay dying in the hospital, was given, they say they gave him truth serum. Hard to know exactly what was going on. He was certainly in excruciating pain. Supposedly they gave him truth serum and had a red-haired nurse come to his bedside, and they told him this was his beloved, fellow collaborator. And that's when he gave up Hannie's name, where she lived, what was going on, everything, because he thought he was talking to Hannie Schaft. And so that immediately put Hannie's parents and her friends in danger. And in fact, her parents were taken to a concentration camp the next, like later that night. And one of the girls escaped, and both escaped, one more successfully than the other. But yeah, so it was a catastrophe on every level for Jan to get caught and to give up so much information about the resistance. But Hannie, for her part, she really never held any hard feelings for him about it. She felt he didn't even know what he was doing, so that's sort of where she came down on it.
Right. At first, it reads as a possible betrayal, but I think we know better. However, Hannie meets a much more banal end. That interestingly, while her parents are arrested, her house is raided. That is not the point at which Hannie is taken into custody, but over something much more mundane.
Yeah, that's right. Um, as I mentioned, her parents were arrested and taken to one of the 3 concentration camps that were located in the Netherlands, which is something that I certainly didn't know at the beginning of my research, that the extent of how many camps were located there. They did this, of course, to try to draw Hannie out. But it didn't work. And Hannie continued to do her resistance work until one day in March of 1945. So we're getting quite close to what will be the end of the war. Hannie was still in disguise with her hair dye, and she just happened to get checked at a German checkpoint. And they discovered at the bottom of her bag that 9mm pistol, which of course is, grounds for getting arrested. They took her into custody without knowing who she was. And it was only once they got her to the prison and they gave her mandatory shower and kind of cleaned her up. And one of the officers there noticed that her hair dye was starting to come out, and the roots of her hair. I mean, I am pointing to the roots of my own hair because it's such a very human thing. And he plucked out a hair and saw that the roots of her hair were red. She never she never acknowledged her name or identity, even under torture, when she was in the prison. This is a photo of her in the prison. And as you can see, I think she's very skinny. Again, this is quite close to the end of the war. Her clothes look threadbare. And she's told in this photo that she's being taken out into the prison yard to be shot. But in fact, this was just a kind of form of psychological torture. They actually came out to shoot her picture, which is a pun that works in Dutch and English. And I think it's such an incredible document of the resolute courage of this woman that you can see in the photo. Her hands are kind of clenched, but also kind of relaxed. She just looks very confident. And you can see in the smaller photo here, that's Hannie with her dyed black hair when her hair was still dyed. A few days after this, the prison wardens took her out to the dunes by the North Sea and forced her to walk up a dune to execute her before she could turn around, began shooting. One of them hit her in the head and she fell to the ground. She stood up, her head bleeding, and faced her 3 German executioners. And in those last moments of life, just turned to them and said, I can shoot better than you can. Just, insulted them basically. And then they did their worst and she was executed. But again, without ever divulging a single scrap of information that might put anyone in the resistance in jeopardy, and really died a martyr, to the resistance cause.
At every turn, her story, once she has resolved to take action against the Nazis, is unbelievably high drama. And that moment, when she's about to be executed, she's been grazed by a bullet, has been conveyed to us by one of the executioners himself as a witness before he himself was executed. And likewise, there are other witness testimonies from which you've conjured a really beautiful scene in the prison as she enters. I wonder if you could read us that passage, please.
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is once she's been imprisoned. So again, this is the spring, this March of 1945. She's been taken to a prison in Amsterdam. And after evading the Nazis for 3 years, she's finally caught. Now, she hasn't given up her identity, but rumors are already swirling that Hannie Schaft, the girl with the red hair, might be coming to be held in this women's prison. You can walk right past your fate your whole life without seeing it, but prisons are inconspicuous by design. The Amstel-Vansweg prison occupies an entire city block hewn out of slabs of pitted gray stone like something built for a pharaoh. I must have seen the building 1,000 times on my way to the university, yet none of this is familiar. As I'm escorted into the central atrium, the air cools, the acoustics sharpen. Low whispers echo off soaring steel beams. Women of all ages, from lanky teenagers to the hunched and elderly, are grouped in 2s and 3s in their cells, talking or praying or trying to sleep. Heads snap up when I pass by, and I feel their eyes on me from behind. That's when the murmuring begins. Keep going, says the guard. I do, but the whispering slips past us like an incoming fog, rushing ahead into the cells stacked 4 stories high above us. Somewhere up there I hear clapping. Silence, says the guard. And there is silence for a moment. Then the cheering explodes, swirling around us in the quietest of uproars, a floating, growing mist of righteousness. It's the sound of hope, even here in this place. Hannie, Hannie, Hannie Schaft. I don't acknowledge them, but when I pass the last cell, I see an older woman with deep-socketed eyes and long, uncombed hair. She sees me, I see her, and somehow this corpse lifts her claw of a trembling hand. Too weak to stand, she raises one bony fist in salute. Verset, she whispers, resist. I intend to.
Thank you, Buzzy. After her death, within the same year she died, she was already recognized as a national hero. On a scale, not everyone in the resistance came to be honored. Could you tell us about her commemoration and also what happened to the characters who did survive the war?
Yeah. Well, here we see a photo of the royal family coming to pay their respects to Hannie Schaft after the war. As I mentioned, she was shot in the dunes overlooking the North Sea. And that was a place where a lot of resistance members had been shot, and the Germans hoped that their bodies would just be forgotten. But they were all reinterred in the Cemetery of Heroes, and that's where Hannie lies today. Um, and she really, it's really striking. You go to these cemeteries now, she's one of the very few women there, not because women were not a big part of the resistance, because they were, but most of them didn't have as dramatic an resistance experience as she did. Um, and, you know, when she was reburied in November of 1945, tens of thousands of people came to her funeral. There was a miles long procession down the road leading to the cemetery, and that went on for years. She was really remembered. Also, a big part of that was because the people she had worked with, the Oversteegen sisters, they really worked to keep her memory alive as well after the war, you know.
Mhm. And so, speaking of the Oversteegen sisters, both Truce and Freddie survived the war.
Yeah.
Um, and Truce came to be a human rights activist, especially. Freddie, I think, was a little more quiet in her life after the war. But tell us then also about our lovely Feline, to whom at least I became very attached during reading the story. I also have to say Sonia, I was
Yes.
very attached to, who had a
Yeah.
different fate.
Yeah, I was too. We haven't talked about them as much in this talk, but they're a huge part of the book, of course. Um, Here's a beautiful photograph of Feline Polak, as you see here. And Feline did, in fact, she was rushed out of the Schaft house in time to go to a safe house in Amsterdam, and was sort of shuffled between a series of safe houses until the end of the war. At that time, she discovered that her beloved father, who had not gone into hiding, had died, I believe, in Sobibor concentration camp. But her brother was already in America, and so she immigrated to the United States. She met a fellow Jewish survivor of the Holocaust
Mm.
and got married, and she had an incredibly productive and successful life. She pretty much realized all of the professional dreams that she and Hannie and Sonia had had as young college students. She went to work for the World Bank as a lawyer. She was the highest ranking woman at the World Bank for many years. And she also had a big, beautiful family. You can see her here with some of her grandchildren. And I do want to say a special thank you to her children, who were really supportive of my book and of this research, and helped me so much in sort of getting my research going. Freddie and Truce Oversteegen, as you can see together in the photo, they and Feline were both alive until just this past decade. So they led long and productive, healthy lives, and they became, the Oversteegen sisters became very involved in the Hannie Schaft Foundation, which is still around, and promotes the memory of Hannie Schaft, but also of just the spirit of resistance and anti-fascism in general.
Yes, and there we have it, this magnificent statue, sculpture um, um, uh, by Truce Oversteegen, who was an artist
That's right.
and did this sculpture in honor of Hannie Schaft, but also to women in the resistance. dedicated in 1983 with Queen Juliana. That image is so moving.
Yeah, it really is. And Truce, I haven't said enough about her art career, but she's a very successful sculptor. And she also became very involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s and 90s. And she worked with Mandela and Archbishop Tutu and helped found an orphanage for children with HIV. And there are sculptures of hers as well in South Africa, honoring the anti-apartheid movement. I mean, they're an incredible family, the Oversteegens. Amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Buzzy. I really appreciate hearing about this story, the way that you've shared it with us today. Here we see To Die Beautiful, the USA edition of the book, and the UK and also worldwide edition of the book, The Girl with the Red Hair.
Yep.
Olivia, I think we'll turn the floor to you now.
Wonderful. So, audience members, please continue putting your questions into the chat box, and Felix and I jointly will moderate your questions and ask them of Buzzy. So, we haven't done that before, having two moderators, so this is a little bit of an experiment for us, but we'll give it a try. So, while you're formulating your questions, let me just tell you a little bit about what we have upcoming here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So, on our next program, which is on Sunday, March 3rd, in 2 weeks, we do turn our attention back to our hero, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, and we are presenting the United States premiere of a beautiful film that was made by the cultural television station called Arte, A-R-T-E. We do these trips called Journey on the Road to Freedom. They're kind of a pilgrimage trip, and we had this film crew with us on our last tour. And this film crew made just a very touching jewel of a movie about not only the physical journey that the participants went on, but the emotional and journey of memory that they went on as well. Because for many of these families, they didn't grow up knowing that they had been rescued by anybody. Many of the families didn't even know they were Jewish. There are all kinds of family secrets that unpeel like layers of an onion. And I really urge you to sign up for the program and to see this beautiful film. Then our next program, which is on March 17th, features this book. So it's another book talk. It's called Whistleblowers, and it's another brand new book. This is a graphic novel, as you can see. So different from Buzzy's actual novel, historical novel. This is a graphic novel, and we will have on our program the historian Raphael Medoff, who wrote the text, the cartoonist Dean Motter, and then Mark Zaid, who is a present-day activist in the whole idea of whistleblowers. So that is another free program, and it's one you won't want to miss. And then I just wanted to briefly mention that we do have these wonderful playing cards that we've created. Heroes of the Holocaust Rescuer playing cards. It's like an education in a box. And so they are really these fabulous cards. So here is Sousa Mendes himself. And here we have our next hero of the week being released tomorrow. That's André Salomon. She saved a lot of children. Oh, look at that. You have our rescuer playing cards. Look at that, Felix. That's wonderful. So yes, you should all get a pack of cards. I urge you to do so. They are unique and wonderful, and that's all I'll say. So now let's turn to audience questions. So the very first question is about the recognition. So was Hannie Schaft named Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem? And if not, why not? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, she has been, and also, you know, many of the people who sort of are smaller characters in my book, also were so instrumental in helping these Hannie's two Jewish friends, and they were also entered into the Yad Vashem, including the housekeeper of Feline Polak, a woman named Marie Kortz, who was herself German and had immigrated to the Netherlands in the 1930s. And she remained loyal to Feline even once Feline's family had been forced out of their apartment, and once hid Feline in the final days of the war in the kitchen of a home occupied by a Nazi officer and his family, just hoping they wouldn't get caught. And they sat there all night, and Feline got rushed out in the morning and was saved. And so Marie and, you know, people like her were also inducted into the sort of registry there. I do talk about that in the book at the end. There's a historical note that kind of explains what happened to all of the people, the real people in the book, because most of the people named in the book, those are their real names, and I try to stick as closely as possible to their real biographical details.
Felix, you want to take the next question?
Thank you. Yes. So there are some questions about whether Hannie, how Hannie worked with her parents to bring these refugees, whether her parents agreed to it or how they were involved.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good question. And you know, when I began writing this book, my background is in history, so I intended to write a nonfiction, straightforward biography of Hannie Schaft. And after about a year and a half of research, realized I might not have enough material to do that to the standard I wanted to. And after a lot of soul searching, ended up writing this historical novel that still hews very closely to the real story. So when it came to a moment like that, where Hannie comes home with these two Jewish girls, I didn't know, and I was never able to find out if she had gotten their permission or gave them any notification in general. So I made a, you know, imaginative choice in that moment. And in my mind, I thought, you know, it's the kind of favor it's too big of a favor to ask anybody to do that. And so my thought was, Hannie came from this progressive family that talked politics a lot during the 1930s. They were all, you know, on the side of the communists during the Spanish Civil War, and they were very much anti-fascism. So I think she knew on some level her parents were, of course, sympathetic to the plight of the Jews. And I decided to, you know, walk through it as if she just showed up there with them and kind of hoped for the best. And in the book, I do talk about, I sort of imagine what that moment might have been like for her parents. But the one thing we do know is that her parents did incredibly graciously and courageously. They did take those girls in at great personal risk, and that's not disputed. So the technicalities of how it actually happened, I still don't know for sure.
So there's a little bit of confusion that I hope you'll clear up among our audience members. Did you write two different books with two different covers and two different titles? I mean, what's going on here?
It is, I understand your confusion, and believe me, it's an issue. Basically, they're the same book. So those two book covers you saw, The Girl with the Red Hair and To Die Beautiful. This is the American one, is To Die Beautiful, but the content of both books is exactly the same. In the UK, they decided to go with a different title and a different cover, and the way it really works with authors is, I mean, I would have preferred to have the same title across all of them, but the author actually doesn't get final say on that. So, you know, I was fine with it, but it does lead to some confusion. And just to confuse things more, there is this book is being published in Germany in April, which I'm really excited about. And in Germany, it has also a completely different title called I believe it's called We Were Just Girls. So there you go. But if you look up Buzzy Jackson, so far there's only one. There's only one of me, I think. So that should clarify things.
Oh,
Felix?
I like the title of that book. We were just girls until we became badass heroines mowing down Nazis.
Right, right.
And you know, I would like to also know for the audience, for some persons in the audience, what was the fate of her parents and Sonia Frank?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Her parents, so they were taken away to a concentration camp in the Netherlands, but as far as I was able to ascertain, you know, terrible conditions there, but they were not held there for too long. I think it was about 2 months, 2 or 3 months. And then I think the Germans just realized, you know, Hannie wasn't going to give up any information. And her parents, sometimes the Germans would round up Dutch citizens to go send them to work in the salt mines, you know. But her parents were older, and I think they just decided we're just going to cut them loose. So her parents survived the war, and they did not find out the fate of their only daughter, their last remaining daughter, until the war ended. Um, Hannie and rather Truce and Feline went to the prison the day the Allies liberated Amsterdam, and they went there with a bouquet of red tulips, waiting for Hannie to come out. And finally, the last woman came out of the prison, and it wasn't Hannie. And Truce said, "We just gave the flowers to the last woman exiting, and we knew." Sonia had left the Schaft house earlier before Feline. She very understandably, I think, just couldn't bear to stay trapped in a tiny room. I think we're all familiar with, you know, the Anne Frank's living conditions. It was something like that for her and Feline. And so she opted to try and escape. She was trying to escape to Switzerland. She actually did manage to make it onto a train and got almost to Switzerland, but didn't quite make it and was captured by the Germans. And she was killed in Auschwitz, sadly. And her family, members of her family did survive the war. However, I believe her mother survived and continued to live in Amsterdam after the war.
Now, here's a question that I'm not sure was addressed, and that is, you're a historian, you have a PhD, and it's a true story. So tell us why you chose to make this a novel, a piece of historical fiction. Tell us about that process and what the difference is, and tell us
Sure.
about that.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I am a historian by training, and I did intend, when I first learned about Hannie Schaft, which was in the winter of 2016, I just assumed there must be a lot of books about her already because what an incredible story, and discovered that there hadn't been any even in Dutch for quite a while, and there weren't any in English at the time. So I thought, I'll go ahead. I'm a historian. I know how to do historical research. I'll try to write this biography of her in English to bring her story to a wider audience. And as I alluded to before, about a year and a half or 2 years into the research process, I started to worry that this book was going to be kind of a dry history because I did not have much access to Hannie's own voice. And by that, I mean, we all know the story of Anne Frank, and she's the most famous victim of the Dutch Holocaust. But that's basically because she kept a diary. That's why we know about her life. And like most people, Hannie did not keep a diary. So I only had direct quotes from people's memories of her, and a few letters and essays she had written when she was younger. And at that point, my agent actually said, "Well, why don't you write it as a historical novel?" I was personally not immediately enthusiastic about that idea. And I think it's because, being a historian, I just strongly felt the connection to these real people. These are real stories. They're such sad and difficult stories at times that I wasn't sure it would be appropriate. But then I remembered a book a little book you may have heard of called Schindler's List. And when I reacquainted myself with Schindler's List, I realized Schindler's List is a novel, which I never really think of it as a novel, but it is a slightly fictionized version of a true story. And Thomas Kennelly, in the intro to Schindler's List, he has an author's note in which he laid out every single reservation that I also shared about doing this, about what right do I have to tell this story, da 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 da. And ultimately, he came to the conclusion that it was most important. This was such an important story that it needed to be told in a way that a lot of people could relate to it. And that's also how I felt about Hannie's story. And so I just went forward very cautiously. And as I said, I tried to really stick to the facts as much as possible and really only, intervene where it was more connective tissue or there's a couple composite characters. But most of the sort of unbelievable things that happen in the book are the totally factual things. That I will say that.
Felix?
Yeah, there's a question I see on here, or a comment, with regard to um, the Dutch and betraying Jews during the war, betraying people in the resistance. Isn't it true that this happened a lot? I'm not so sure about that. I don't know what Buzzy knows, but it draws, I think of the opposite of all the people contributing those invisible acts, those
Mm.
quiet acts of resistance that helped people like Hannie Schaft and her family succeed in their own resistance. Buzzy, could you perhaps comment on that, with
Yeah,
also regard to the house there in Harlem as
yeah,
an
yeah.
example?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, I was by no means an expert on the Dutch experience of World War II before I began researching this book, almost 8 years ago now. And one of the really shocking facts to me is still shocking to me is the that the Netherlands went from a place known for religious tolerance. I mean, for hundreds of years was known as one of the most religiously tolerant places in the world, probably, certainly in Europe. Um, how this place goes from that reputation and a place where Jews had been integrated into the society for hundreds of years to becoming statistically the most dangerous country in occupied Western Europe, apart from Germany itself, for Jews. 75% of all the Jews in the Netherlands were killed during the Holocaust, which is a staggering percentage. And it is higher than any of its surrounding countries, including France, Belgium, places like that. And I don't think it's because the Dutch people collaborated more than in other places. In fact, there's evidence that they stood up to the Nazis in ways that people in other countries didn't. They had a general strike, for instance, in 1941. That is the only mass uprising of non-Jewish people on behalf of their Jewish fellow citizens in Europe during the war. 300,000 people went on strike to protest. So there's a lot of evidence of people, doing really dangerous things to protect Jews. So I think it's kind of there are, of course, people who collaborated with the Nazis, but there is an incredibly strong streak of people supporting the resistance. As Felix, as you mentioned, most of those were in very invisible, small, but very important, meaningful ways. For example, in the photo of Hannie's house that we saw earlier, it's essentially like kind of a duplex, triplex kind of place. She shares walls on both sides of that house. And when I saw that house, which is still standing in Harlem and other people live there now, the minute you look at it, you realize, well, people on the other side of the wall must have they must have suspected something when suddenly the population of the Schaft home goes from 2 people, Hannie's parents, to 4 people, which also meant they had to find food for these girls. They had to do laundry without attracting attention that they had extra people there. So, I mean, I think that her house itself is such a good example of basically their neighbors never turned them in, never said anything to the police, and that was a risk for them as well, you know, because they easily could have been charged with keeping a secret like that. So, um, so much of the Dutch resistance is in these very, very small but hugely important acts that are not as dramatic as shooting a Nazi officer, you know, but very, very important.
So we're getting to the end of the hour, and so I'd like to invite each of you to make some final remarks. So starting with you, Buzzy.
Sure. Um, I appreciate that you started today's talk, Olivia, with the mention of Navalny. And, um, you know, when I saw that headline just yesterday, I guess, um, it's so shocking. You know, when I began the research for this book, again in 2016, we had had a big election here. Brexit had just happened. A lot of things were in turmoil. And at that moment, I felt like, gosh, I can see how Hannie Schaft's story is really relates to this moment. And I thought, if this book ever gets published, I wonder if it will still be relevant. Sadly, I am, you know, it's probably even more relevant now. And in fact, the German publication of the book was pushed back a year because of the Ukraine war and just a feeling that maybe people in Germany were not ready to read this right now, but they're making a big effort this year. I just think Hannie's story and the story of Feline and Sonia and the Oversteegens, it's such a an important story for these times because it's really about how far would you go to protect the people that you love and to protect your neighbors. And I think no matter where in the world you live right now, it's an important question to start asking yourself. The only other thing I will say is just want to thank the Susan Mendez Foundation and you, Olivia. Thank you so much. This foundation does such important and wonderful programming on these issues that are increasingly relevant and very, very important. So thank you for all the work you do. And it's a real honor to be a part of this today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Buzzy. Felix, the last word goes to you.
Thank you, Olivia. And thank you for your closing comments, Buzzy. They're touching. I would also intone the importance to us at this time of Navalny. Actually, as it turns out, when I gave a presentation 2 years ago with Michaela von Habsburg about her father, Otto, it was just on the cusp of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and at that time, we asked who will be those characters, those people who hold tyranny to account. It was just what, a week or 2 weeks away from that invasion, and at that time it was Navalny, and now he's dead. And Hannie Schaft is also dead. We don't have to be Navalny's and we don't have to be Hannie Schaft's, but I hope that we are the next door neighbors of the Schafts as a start. Doing quiet things of perhaps resistance or aiding the humanitarian effort in its best form. And I love how this program always profiles the different ways we can take action and act on our courage, depending our ability to express it.
What a perfect note to end on. So I wanted to thank Buzzy, first of all, for your profound and beautifully written book, as people have commented in the chat. Felix, the care with which you took, first of all, that you found Buzzy and introduced her to me and proposed the program, and the care you took in moderating. And of course, our loyal audience, nice big audience. I hope you'll all come back for our next program. So see you soon. Have a nice rest of your day. Be well, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.